Make that a cold drop. Make that I dare you to make that a cold drop.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Neil Almond.
Good to be back.
And Lloyd Williams-Jones.
Hello there.
And together, we're going to explore routines. But first, Neil, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So I've not been away on holiday this Easter, so I've stuck very much to the script of reading educational texts and books, and I've gone for something that I found quite recently called Development of a Sustainable Place Value Understanding. And these researchers believe they have come up with a empirical hierarchical sequence of developments that you go through to until you have a complete understanding of place value. I've been reading, I think because of the work that we've been doing with ATL on a Wednesday and going through that CPD course college, I've kind of been quite interested by how place value originates, and particularly how it's taught at primary school, because if you fail to really understand place value, then the rest of mathematics is locked out for you. So I've been really interested in what their model of place value looks like and whether there's anything from there that we can garner as to how it might improve our instruction in how we teach it. Lloyd, what have you been reading for?
Thanks, Neil. So I have been on holidays to Egypt. So my reading's slightly lighter around the pool, but I did read a really interesting book called Gypsy Boy. And it's a story of a man called Mikey Walsh, who was a Romany gypsy. And it's his story. It's quite a harrowing story, actually, about his experience in the travel community as he's gay. And basically, it's a very dark, but quite funny at times, sort of narrative that takes you right up to his kind of escape from the community in the end. It really resonated with me because obviously our community being such a large percentage of Gypsy Romany traveller, I was really intrigued by how he perceived LGBTQ plus and that kind of how that was viewed within his community. Obviously, it's something that we need to talk about in schools, and it's, you know, for us it's a challenging situation. So I was very, very interested and in his journey, and he eventually became a teaching assistant actually for a short while before he started writing his books. So I'd really like to speak to him actually. He's on Twitter. I have sent him a message, but I don't know whether he'll reply. But I'd really like to tap into his sort of experience and his understanding. So so it was a really, really hard read, but and also quite a, you know, I can put it down. So Kieran, what you reading for?
I don't think my holiday read lends itself as well to my job. By the pool, I was reading the second in the first Law trilogy, which is sort of like a low fantasy trilogy. I think there's 9 books in total. But basically, it's about this big epic story that's happening, you know, almost like Vikings with a little bit of magic. And but like I say, I can't find a way to squeeze it into what you know, except for the fact that reading is a really enjoyable pastime, and it's good to have some time while the kids are sort of floating around and spend time jumping into the swimming pool. But in terms of education, recently I was at a Kent and Medway maths conference type thing for the people who work with them over the year, and they gave everyone a free book, and the one I took was Algebra, which is sort of a relation of Algebra, which sort of looks at how we can make algebra more accessible to pupils of 11 years and above. And this Algebra is for 11 years and below, and it's like 100 tasks. I'm going to butcher his name, but it's designed by Dietmar Kuckelmann. And, I think he's Professor Smudge on Twitter. And essentially what this says is, try to challenge pupils to engage with early algebra and pre-algebra, and, and how much that is important. And, so if we're looking for great tasks, look no further. And they're collecting this book that's been published by the Association of Teachers of Mathematics, so well worth checking out. So the focus of this week's episode is routines. And Lloyd, I think there are a few better placed to explain what do we mean by routines.
There's a lot of writing around routines, and there's some really smart thinkers as well around routines. PEPs, obviously, James Clear, his Atomic Habits, and it influences a lot of thinking around it. So I was kind of having a read and thinking about where I could get the best description of this. But the one I think is a great way to capture what we mean by routines is from Joe Kinnard's blog, who is I believe a secondary RE teacher, very, very smart guy, writes really well. So I'm just going to read his definition because I think this was a nail on the head. He said, a routine is a sequence of actions triggered by a specific prompt or cue that is repeated so often it becomes an automatic response. And I think that kind of, for me, that captures the very kind of clean, clear, almost cog-sized sort of description of what a routine is. But I'd like to supplement that with something James Clear said from Atomic Habits. And that's, he said, the seed of every habit is a single decision. And for me, that as teachers, what we mean by routines is supporting children to make those decisions so that we can grow those flowers, if you will. I think just both of those definitions side by side give a kind of good rounded feel to what we mean when we say routines.
Yeah, not much to add there. I agree with everything you said. I just think it's important as class teachers, you're looking through that lens of routines for children. As school leaders, you're not only looking at how you can support class teachers within that, but also you're probably thinking, well, what routines could we put in place for teachers to make their working lives as easy as possible as well?
Are we thinking about routines on two different scales then, perhaps? Are there routines that are, I don't really want to use macro and micro because then I'll just get sort of pigeonholed as someone who describes everything in macro and micro terms. But are there things that lend themselves to sort of bigger scale operations, and some things like, because of your initial description, Lloyd, I'm thinking this is really small and forensic in the classroom. Are there two layers, or am I misinterpreting what it is supposed to be about?
All routines, if you will, can be broken down to smaller actions, whether that's adult routines or whether that's children's routines or whether that's routines of the school business manager or the school office or whichever part of the school it is. It's a series of actions that happen in a certain order to make things automatic and to make things flow better, and obviously to create space as well. And I know we're going to go on to probably talking about the importance later on, but I do think, I think you could look at it from different levels. I think that's something that I hadn't really thought about until Neil just said there. And I've been really sort of focusing my mind on the routines for children, but he's absolutely spot on in terms of it's everyone in the school, isn't it? Because the school is a living, breathing organism, and it all needs to have, everyone needs their routines to make things run as smoothly as possible and to make things as effective as possible. And again, I don't know that necessarily it's a macro micro in terms of adults, children, or school level and child level almost. You could separate those out, but I think ultimately at the base of it, it boils down to the simplicity of it's a series of actions that are taken in a sequence that make sense to make people effective and to allow for the goals to be met, I think. And again, we'll go on to unpacking some of that in a bit.
I'm not trying to catch out, genuinely wondered how we sort of, articulate these ideas. It makes so much sense that we want things to be as fluid as possible and as efficient as possible. Why are routines important in that process?
I think it just can go back to, and you can really just strip it all back to the cognitive load theory, working memory overload, and regards to all of that stuff, both at the adult level and child level. If you've chunked and automatized these routines, it effectively allows for far greater scope and thought onto the other several 100,000 decisions that teachers, leaders are having to make every single day. If you can chunk your entry routine as a classroom teacher, and you can get the students to practice that and they're automatic with it, then you as the classroom teacher can just start thinking more about the lesson preparation that's about to come later on, pick up minor social cues that kids are giving off, so you can get to the point where you can preempt and stop potential behavior from happening in the first place. I'd say it just frees up that time where you can really start to think deeply about what that coming day or what that next action that's going to come actually looks like.
It's creating predictability, because that breeds a safety. It breeds a safety for adults, it breeds a safety for children, especially SEND children who need that predictability in routines, but I don't think it's exclusive to them. It's the whole school. Anybody going into their place of work feels more comfortable when they know the routines, when they know that there's a way in a system. And that's why it's so hard when you start a new job and you don't, in a new school, you don't know those routines to start with. The sooner you learn them, the more you get into your stride, the happier you start to become in your job, because that's the way we are sort of predisposed to sort of to function really, really well when we know the order and sequence of things, because of that level of predictability. So I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is the norms, like Neil was saying, there's like those norms that are created within the classroom and in the school. If you want to create a certain culture in your school, norms are part of that culture. And to create those norms, you need to make sure that the routines are tight and they're shared. And I know we'll pick up on that a little bit later in terms of how we do that. But for norms and for predictability, I would say they're two like key kind of like pillars, and that's under the sort of the importance of routines.
Yeah, as you guys are speaking, the phrase that's come to mind is, it's not the severity of the consequence, but the certainty of the consequence that's important. And that's one of the things I learned very, very early on in my teaching career, was that where pupils knew exactly what the boundaries were, they knew exactly what was expected of them, then they felt safer and felt more able to sort of go with the critical mass. And I know obviously these routines don't just apply to behavior, but as you're speaking, I'm thinking, yeah, that could definitely, you could extrapolate that out across everything. And I know that as an adult, I certainly feel security in knowing exactly what to do and what's expected of me, because then it makes decisions much more easily made. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that, both for children and adults. So then, which routines should be established, and then potentially in what order?
For me, it's always kind of been the transition, thinking about this on a child level, that a teacher might implement, or that there might be a whole school system in place or a whole school routine in place. For me, it's always those transitions, that lining up at the beginning of the day, how you walk through the school, how children go from playground into classroom, how they might transition between lesson, how they might transition between gathering around a teacher's desk for a practical, or if you're thinking key stage 1, how they might transition from the carpet area back to their tables, how they transition from getting their food to being ready to learn again for the afternoon. Those for me are the key transitions, because they're the ones where, and again, bringing back to drawing parallels to cognitive load theory, those are the ones that children can do quite a lot because they naturally do those transitions day in, day out. But if they're not thinking what those transitions actually look like. They can do those transitions without actually learning how to do those transitions, if that makes sense. And so for me, it's always those transitions and thinking about those and giving teachers the freedom to practice those transitions with their students at the start of term, because I would say mostly those are the transitions where pupils don't have much of a chance to practice. So there is that ambiguity as to how they are expected to behave and what they're expected to do. And that's where, when you have that ambiguity, that's where some behavior is likely to rear itself, which can cause more behavior and more work for you later on down the line. So those are the ones that I definitely think should be thought about and considered first, and where those involve communal spaces that the whole school uses, I probably think there should be some principles set by senior leaders to what those routines actually look like. So there's that consistency then between year groups, so they know what's expected of everyone all the time.
The place to start is behavior, isn't it? Behavior routines. We start our ECTs, our early career teachers, with behavior. We set off with behavior because the behavior sets the standard, sets the culture for the school, and no learning can be done without that. So it's almost at a child level, at a teacher level, at a top leadership level. If you're coming into a school new and you want to make your own impact, the first place you look is your behavior, isn't it? Because everything starts from there, and those routines around behavior. So for me, it's like, because that behavior routine, or those specified routines in those areas, create the time for learning. They carve out the space for learning. Without that, your space diminishes, because you spend your time firefighting, and you spend your time, like Neil says, the behavior rears its ugly head, and all of a sudden half your lesson's gone because you're wrestling getting them from the carpet and getting the pens out and getting the books handed out and all the rest of these things. Or, you know, you're a new teacher and you've not really thought carefully about how you've lined your class up or whatever, and who's standing by who, and then there's chatting and disruption in the line and you're having to reline them up. It's all these things, you know, that all come back to behavior. So for me, the first thing is behavior routines in terms of ordering. I would then say instructional routines. So then once behavior is kind of set and we know how to stop and listen, you know, and all these things are part and parcel of the sort of the conversation going on now with walkthroughs, and you know, there's some fantastic supporting documents and blogs and things out there to codify some of this stuff. But then the second, the instructional routines in terms of, you know, how we then maximize the most out of the learning. So like, how then do we go about the lesson in maths? How do we go about the lesson in English? What does that look like? How do we create routines within the lessons that structure the learning to support the best learning opportunities for the children in that sense? So behavior to create the time, instructional to create the most potential from the actual learning that's going on in the lesson, I would say, in terms of ordering. It's huge routines. Obviously, you could apply, you know, you could start, like you say, you can start zooming out and start looking at different areas of the school. But I would say if we are sort of looking at a classroom, which I would imagine there's lots of people listening who are kind of thinking of it in that way, that those two, sort of behavior and then instructional, might be a smart place to start.
You mentioned communal areas and having general principles, and I might be putting you on the spot, but what would your principles be for those sort of shared areas?
I think it's very much up to the school as to what they want, what they want them to be. But what you can't have is a system where if you're walking through a corridor, one teacher does demand that their class does it in silence, and one teacher isn't too fussed or bothered whether they do it in silence, as long as they kind of do it, as long as they get from A to B. Purely because then it just opens up the teachers for that chat that always happens. And I don't think any schools eradicated it completely, but the whole, but when Miss or when Sir is teaching us, we can do this, we are allowed to do that. And so it kind of creates that cognitive conflict in their mind about what they can and can't do. And some children can't cope. They find it very difficult to cope with that difference in expectations. I'm personally a fan of Andrew Percival's model, who spoke about something similar to this at Research Ed, and his idea that, this idea that behavior is a curriculum. So he shared out what his behavior curriculum actually looks like, and that is available on the Stanley Road website for people who want to look at it. But he has something called, fantastic walking, where that is, they've decided as a school, that is, pure silence throughout the corridors. It's purposeful walking, so there's no dawdling or dilly-dallying. It's hands behind their back, not because Andrew enjoys, controlling bodies, etc., but it's so if your hands are behind your back, and that's the expectation for everyone, they're not going to have those issues where, two classes are walking past and, a cheeky little hit or a cheeky little slap, happens as those classes are walking back, because they are going to be, the expectation is hands behind your back. So there is no, there's nowhere to hide with that. They can't just say, oh, sir, I was just swinging my arm, and then, he came into me or whatever. No, if your hands are behind your back, there's no way that you're going to accidentally, make contact with someone else. So I think that's a pretty good one. And he calls it fantastic walking. So for staff, that almost allows that routine to be chunked as fantastic walking. So staff can say, they can be really specific in their praise of, well done, Callum, you're showing fantastic walking. Or if you need that reminder, you can say, Lloyd, I need to see that fantastic walking now, thank you. And they know what those instructions, that routine is chunked, so the students know what that is. It's easily said to put that positive swing on it when you're correcting them. So say that's just an example currently of what Andrew has at his school, which I think sounds to be quite effective. And I think it's something that we need to potentially look at the school I'm currently in after going to that session.
Quite often a bit of kickback. I know you're a bit reticent to sort of say certain things there, but there's I don't understand it. There's kickback about schools where they have those expectations, but having spent a lot of time in a lot of schools and seeing the difference in even just the sense around the school where effective routines for behavior are in place and where they're not, it's night and day. There's a massive disparity between the opportunity to use every moment as best as possible. And like you said, Lloyd, earlier on, half your lesson's gone, because of something that happened when you're walking from assembly to your classroom, and I think, just as an aside, walking with your hands behind your back is my preferred mode of walking around the school. It's got almost a Sherlock Holmes air to it, doesn't it? I'm sort of like, yeah. That's like I said, that's just an aside. But like Lloyd, when you talked about instructional, so we've established how important those behavioral sort of routines are. When you're talking about instructional, are we thinking solely from the teacher's point of view? Because I know, Neil, you've shared in the past things where classes have really effective routines for getting ready for learning, which I don't think fall into behavior. I don't think fall fully into what my understanding of instructional is. I don't know how we define those, but do you sort of go as far as having routines for how things go in and out? Because in a maths lesson, you will have X manipulative brought out, but it won't be there for your English lessons or whatever. I don't know. Tell me more about that, Lloyd.
Yeah, it's interesting. That line between what we define as behavior and instruction, I think it's not crystal clear. And I think I was wrestling with it earlier when I was sort of thinking about it. I was like, what does that fall into instructions? Because essentially it's a behavior that they're showing, but it is instructional in the sense that they're carrying out an instruction, but they're always carrying out instructions when we do that. So you could get into this nuanced argument around whether it is instructional. I guess for the usefulness of defining it in terms of instructional behavior, yeah, I would argue that the lesson start sequence would sort of come into that in terms of and it may be then taken further with the type of lesson that you're doing. So for example, like we've been working quite hard recently on our feed forward sessions. Now they're inspired by Claire Celian. Went to see her school when she was up at St. Matthias and looking at what they were doing with editing and proofing, really smart stuff. So we've been implementing that model over the last couple of weeks. So getting feedback from our teachers, doing some CPD, some deliberate practice on it. And, you know, there's a whole set sequence to that lesson. You know, when it is a feed forward session, there's a very clear structure to how we run that session, you know. And with paired proofing, one book goes on top of the other book, then they swap over, then one's the pen, one's the brain, like Chris has said before. We have all these things communicated to staff and practiced with teachers. So when we come to that sort of lesson, it maximizes the learning time, it maximizes the predictability for children. It allows them to engage with that learning on a deeper level, hopefully, because they are familiar with the structure of it. Now, we're in early stages, so it's not very good at the moment, to be quite honest. It was really slow, and the children are trying to get their heads around it. But like we did with our reading when we rolled that out, and we rolled out obviously Chris's you know, sort of principles from his book, we spent a lot of time working on that shared dialogue and practicing that stuff and codifying those routines around, you know, finger freeze, eyes on me, rulers down, all of these little tiny things, all of these actions, and you know, are what creates routines. And it's something that, like you say, I think you can split it into behavior and instruction, but fundamentally it's about, I think it's them following or carrying out an action, isn't it, on a given command. And I think, like, to go back to Joe's definition right back to the start, you know, a sequence of actions triggered by a prompt. So you get to that automaticity that Neil was saying, where it's cued, and then a sequence of things happens, like a chain of things happens in an order to move certain things on. Now, within the lesson, you know, it's not, the chains aren't necessarily going to be that long all the time, but there's a series of lots of different ones. And with the repetition of sorts of lessons, we build that predictability, and the children know what's coming, and they understand, and they know what the expectation and the norm is for it. So I think it's you know, like having that start lesson sequence. We as a staff codified that very early on this year. We sat down as a team and we worked it together. We said, right, what do we want for the optimum sort of start lesson procedure here? You know, I know that sounds a bit clinical, but essentially that's what it is. You know, to use Matt Swain's term, minimize the bleed between sessions and minimize the bleed between different phases and stages of the learning. If you can do that, you're going to get your children operating far more efficiently. So that was one of the things we decided to do, was sit down together and talk together about creating what would create the less bleed. And we really sweat that really small stuff. We said, like, you know, so on our same day, we have a daily same day intervention slot. During that time, for example, the books for the next session are all handed out. There is no handing out of books, you know, it's all ready to go. In the morning, the book's handed out, it's ready to go. So there's none of that kind of like, and where they are collected in. And I know there's been the videos on Twitter of the super fast sort of pass the books to the end. And, you know, I know that's caused some controversy as well. But the bottom line is, you know, I'm not saying you have to do it that fast, but if there's a system, you reach the goal. You know, we set all these little goals, and when we break all the learning down, we break everything down to small goals, but it's the systems that get us there. It's not the goals, is it? It's the systems that get us to the goals. So define those systems, define the systems. And I guess we might have stepped now into how do we leverage it, Kieran? I don't know. You know, we might have just made a foray into the next question potentially.
Yeah, before we go into that though, because I was about to say you're almost bridging into how we can establish these routines, you know, for maximum leverage. But I'm thinking about your routine for CPOMs, which I don't know if other people don't use CPOMs. It's essentially behavior incident tracking software, I want to say. That's something you've established with your teachers, a routine that then you follow as deputy head teacher. I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit more on that, and maybe if there were other routines for adults in similar situations. I don't know, I think people would be really interested to hear about them.
Yeah, I think the behavior, yeah, that fits obviously with behavior and the behavior routines, I suppose. And I'm sure there are many, well, and there are obviously hundreds of schools that use CPOM software. It's a very smart software, very elaborate, very safe. But I think, it can be used at different levels. It can be used, some schools use it on a very sort of surface level, other schools use it in an extremely deep and analytical way. We had some challenging behavior in our school, we as I'm sure all schools do. And so we decided that we needed to create really clear routines for teachers around what we do with that, in terms of sort of a centralized reflection for children potentially that made the wrong choices, and how we record that as a staff, every member of staff being on CPOMs and having access to CPOMs. And that is the case even down to the dinner ladies that can access a computer after lunch to log any incidents that need logging. Those are then logged, and on a weekly basis, we review our behavior and we discuss it at our senior leadership meeting. So I produce a report, which is very easy to do from CPOMs. Once I say it's very easy to do. It can be done once you know what you're doing with it. It is very easy. It's not the most simple of interface in the first instance, as I'm sure people listening who use CPOMs can relate. But once you've established the report setting, it is actually very easy. I just come in on a Monday morning, run my report. It then goes to our senior leadership meeting. We analyze trends of behavior. When we tag our behavior in, we tag locations, we tag what has happened as a sanction, if there is one. We keep a running record as well then of who is in reflections, and there's very clear systems and routines in terms of review and then respond. So that is a constant cycle. And then termly, we do a termly analysis, which is a part of our yearly, it's a routine thing that happens across the year. And we feed that back in. So if we for example, we noticed before half term, we were having a cluster of incidents outside the junior toilets around the back. So we sort of said, hang on, and we looked at our routines and we looked at what we were doing, and we split out the year 5 and 6 to do different toilets and put somebody in place. And we haven't had a behavior incident since there. It's things like that. It's looking at trends and patterns in that sense, sweating that stuff, and running those routines constantly. We've managed to get a really good level of behavior now. And so where we were in November, where we had some really challenging stuff, and we hadn't really bedded this system in, now we're seeing real sort of fruits of that labor. So it's about, like you say, finding what works for your school in terms of a routine, but like having that kind of thought around those smaller actions and creating those repetitive incidents, like, with that SLT thing, running that report every week, and without fail, it is first on the agenda every week. It doesn't fall off. It's like it sits at the heart of the meeting, because it's really important, isn't it? We say how important behavior is for the culture of the school. So have that kind of standing and have that position in your meetings, and make it part of that routine.
It's fascinating how much detail you've gone into there, Lloyd, to make that routine. And I think, did you do a Twitter thread on this a while back? Maybe not that long ago.
Yeah, I'll repost it once the episode comes out. I did a little thread on just explaining how we sort of analyze and break down the different areas. But again, it's about how to get that routine to be what it is, and almost to leverage that routine. That you need to make sure that you've laid the groundwork first before. There's a lot of parts to that. That hasn't just happened overnight. That's taken a while to get to that point since we put CPOMs in. Was it about a year ago? Year and a half ago, we put the system in. So it's taken time to evolve to get to that point. But and I'm sure that feeds into sort of how you get there with routines and things, because it's a long game.
So Neil, how can we establish our routines for maximum leverage?
I think the Gene Simmons principle is one to bring into this, and that's the keep it simple, silly principle. I think it's very easy to think that these routines need to be somewhat elaborate in their design to get from A to B, where that's not the case at all. The simpler that you keep things, the clearer that you are about them, the more likely that they are to succeed. That said, I think there are a few other things that we can do to make sure. So I think Lloyd mentioned this earlier about you may want this a routine or a sequence of routines to go and form a habit. So you might chain certain actions together to form that routine, and then you might want to think about how that routine is then combined with other routines to create a particular habit. So I'm thinking particularly about what our end of the day routine or our end of the day habit perhaps would be better, because the routine itself or the habit is several routines put together, and how we expect the children to put things away, how we expect any books to be passed down. Then children all are expected to read, and we'll call out children row by row to go and get their things, and we think really carefully about where we stand, or where the adult stands, to make sure that they can monitor what's going on in the cloakroom, because our cloakrooms really aren't particularly great for managing behavior because they're very small. Children in year 6 seem to be getting physically quite larger these days than I remember. So it's all about how you think about managing that. Thinking about a really solid cue to kind of start that routine off is particularly effective. I'm not a particular fan of using voice to be that cue, purely because you're speaking enough as a classroom teacher. If you can find ways to minimize, if you can create a chain of actions and a chain of routines, and it's effective, and you can implement that without having to speak, then that's great. And I think what you should be aiming for, so you can save your voice. As well as, I think, having a timed element to it where the routine that you're expecting suits it, because I'm just a big fan of having almost that accountability for those students, that you are given more than enough time to be able to do this, and this is the goal that we're aiming for. And children really enjoy kind of turning that into a game where you can say, okay, we were able to put everything away, we passed the books down, everyone was reading, and it took us 5 minutes to get everyone out of the class to get their books and come back, get their bags and coats and come back into the classroom. Let's see if we can do it in 4.5 minutes, next week. So you can kind of challenge them that way to gradually decrease that amount of time that's needed for them to do that, which again just means you can maximize learning just that little bit more. I think the other thing to do, and again, is to not be afraid to just front load that time at the beginning of a new year, at the beginning of a new term, just to practice. Forgetting doesn't just happen within the subjects, forgetting happens within the routines as well that we try to impart onto students. So allowing children that practice time, that time to recall and remember what those routines look like, I think are really important to make sure that they are as effective as possible.
For me, in terms of maximum leverage, you as leaders in schools, you need to consider your rollout, your implementation. So like Neil said there, you need to consider how and when you're going to address this with your teachers and then with your children. So like Neil said, forgetting happens, routine fatigue can set in, and a revision and revisiting of routines needs to be systematic, and it needs to be rigorous, because all the best will in the world, like you say, tired teachers, week 5 of term 4, whatever it is, things you're on your knees. It's a very tough job. It's then that those routines can slip, and because the teachers are tired, the children are tired, and it's very, and it will happen. Fatigue will happen, but that's where, as leaders, we have responsibility to carefully, and I mean this now carefully, because it's not about being draconian with the way in which you reinforce. It's about doing it in a supportive manner, but prompting and if you create that culture in your school, that's the thing that we do, that's the norms that you are going to expect a little conversation, a little nudge from a leader at that point in the term to help you, just support you through that time, and just to make sure that everybody's doing what they're doing and celebrate that. That's, for me, that's what we're going for now. One excellent thing I saw, and this sort of feeds into the other point I would make, which is the codification of routine. Now, for me, the codification of routine, which is again what Neil touched on there, is vital. If you can capture it, you can then share it, and you can reshare it, and you can go back to it. Whereas if you agree it and practice it, and it kind of sits in the, I don't know, the school atmosphere, if you will, it just, you have agreed it, but it's not been captured and recirculated and summarized. And for me, Sonia Thompson, actually, they film their routines. Now, something I've been looking to do next term with my school is actually capturing on video what it looks like. So what a fantastic thing to do in terms of smart thinking, like share that video then with staff who can then share with children. Let's just remember how we do excellent walking, or fantastic walking, like Neil said. Let's just watch it. Models. Let's show models. Let's go back and revisit models to stave off some of that fatigue. It's just really smart from it. And I thought that was really, really clever. So your implementation, your codification, and your reinforcement are sort of the top ways that you are going to get to leverage this stuff. And like on the ground, like Neil said, gamification is an excellent tool to get children motivated to do this as well. But the bottom line is, it's the systems that you create to support the routines that sit within them that are the most important thing. It's like, I go back to it, it's the systems, not the goals. The end goal is the learning, is the good behavior. We need to make sure those solid systems are in place and revisited, and almost you fill in the tank with petrol up a little bit to get us to each of those milestone holidays before we reset and go again.
Kind of sharing the why with the students, why you're running these routines the way that they are, so they understand the reason, and you want to use that inclusive language of, the reason we are doing this is so that you can be safe, so that you can learn as much as you can with the time that you have in school, so that we can all have the opportunity to reach our potential during this phase of our education, whatever phase that might be in. And I think children kind of really appreciate, and it kind of helps that sense of belonging that I think all students need and want from when they come to school, because they're not just being told, arbitrarily to, put your hands behind your back while you walk, as if they are on some sort of, prison line or whatever it might be. There is a clear why we're asking you to do that. And I think there's an element of teachers modeling it as well, where possible, if possible, in the sense that obviously modeling it to how students are done, but unless you are carrying something from A to B, then I think the teacher probably should walk like that as well, so that it doesn't give the impression of one rule for them, one rule for us. But if they can see that being modeled, and they can see that it's not just a teacher thing that's done to the pupils, this is how we all expect anyone to walk through our school, that just helps that buy-in, helps that belonging, and they can understand better why they need to do that, as opposed to just being told that they need to do it.
Capturing that why is essentially spot on. And I just mentioned about codification in terms of Sonia and the videos, but I also think handbooks and policies and things are really useful places to codify routines. If you make this part of the fabric of the school, when anybody new joining, anybody that can be new staff, new children, anything, there is a codified place where, on a shared drive, for example, like we have, sits a handbook that has this small detail in it and supporting modeled videos. So you have the modeling examples and the codification of what the routine is. And I know that sounds like a lot, and it sounds, it's something that is a bigger task, and it's something that will evolve as your school develops and improves. You know, I'm not saying overnight go and write up all of your routines. That's not how it's going to work. You know, the distribution of that is important. Your middle leader distribution around what they want, for example, like you say, a feed forward session to look like in those routines. But then the whole staff handbook, I know that, you know, you can definitely say that there are people that have come in to roles who are great teachers who then, unfortunately, in some circumstances, in some schools, fall victim to the fact that they didn't know that this routine should have run in a certain way with the specifics, and then they feel the wrath of an SLT that haven't probably shared that with them, and it's not necessarily their fault. They just didn't know, you know, and we then have teachers in a position where they're punished for something that really isn't their fault, you know. So we as leaders have a duty to codify, to share our expectations, to reinforce, revisit those expectations, to stay the fatigue, so that it captures that, you know, it really encapsulates that culture in the school, and drives home those norms, and shares that dialogue wide and clearly, in a really precise way.
Every mistake I made in my NQT year was in the handbook. I really wish that I had known to look at the handbook, because it was as detailed and codified as you described, Lloyd. And it was definitely my fault when I felt the wrath, because I should have read it. I should have been clear on what I had to do, and I would have made half the mistakes that I did make. But, you know, so I think anyone who's listening and at the start of their career, if you have such a handbook in place, you know, make it your job to at least be familiar with it before you start the role. You know, say you take a job in June with a September start, you know, try and use that time to familiarize yourself with it. And I think if you're anyone who is writing such a handbook, well, like listening to you guys today, you could almost take your principle, Lloyd, from, you know, you're developing your curriculum where you've got phase 1, 2, and 3. Well, in phase 1, you could have, well, let's develop the behavior part of the handbook and routines for behavior, then the transitions, maybe those closer together, and then later the instruction and the instructional part. And then in those 3 phases, over the course of maybe, let's say, a year and a half, you could have developed that without having to say, okay, I'm going to write a 20-page book on the routines in our school all in one go, because that's a surefire way for things to go wrong, because things will be overlooked, they won't be checked, and then, you know, you're back to square one, or you have moved on since then. You know, I think in my head this is going to be quite a short episode, but I've got the feeling that, you know, we could talk about this for quite a long time, and it's great that, you know, both of you guys sort of executing the role of deputy head as well as you do. You know, it's brilliant listening, because it just shows how long it's been since I've been in that position, because I'm thinking I've got nothing of value to add to this conversation compared to you guys at the minute. So it's been brilliant. It's funny you mentioned Sonia, because anyone listening will have one more day to write a review of the podcast to sort of get a chance to win a copy of her excellent book, An Ethic of Excellence in Action. You know, so this will go out on the Saturday of Easter. I'm going to make the draw online on Sunday. Yeah, so if, you know, get your reviews in wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you know, you could have a copy winging its way to you. All that's left to do is say thank you very much, Lloyd.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.